Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us all today for this presentation about ICE and immigration detention. My name is Harrison Hanvey, and I'm the Manager of Outreach and Partnerships for the Office of Justice and Ecology in the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States. I also serve as the co-chair for the Jesuit Migration Network of the same region. For those of you who would prefer to hear the conversation in Spanish today, let me explain how the interpretation feature works. If you look down at the bottom of your screen where the icons of the applications are, you'll see one that says interpretation. If you are on a phone or a tablet, you might have to click the three dots that say more that'll be in the bottom right of your screen. But once you open that icon, that globe icon that says interpretation, you'll see language options and there will be an option to select Spanish. When you click Spanish, you'll go into the sala, the room of interpretation, and there you'll be able to hear the interpreter translate this presentation to Spanish. Let me say that also in Spanish for those of you that would probably be more helpful. Entonces, si prefieren escuchar la presentación en español, abajo en la pantalla va a haber un globito, un icono de un globito, o si están aquí en tu teléfono, pueden ver, hay tres puntitos. Si tocan esos tres puntitos, va a salir algo que dice interpretación. Ahí, si lo eliges, puedes elegir el idioma de español. Cualquier cosa ahí puedes escuchar en español. Siempre puede regresar a la sala de inglés, pero si quiere escuchar en español, ahí se puede escuchar. Y también puedes elegir si quieres oír o no oír al orador original del fondo, seleccionando silenciar audio original. Okay. I will put those interpretation notes in the chat as well here in just a second for any who join later. Today is the third webinar in a series that has been coordinated by several partners within the Jesuit Migration Network since the 2024 U.S. elections. With unprecedented threats to immigrants in the U.S. and across the hemisphere, we hope that this information shared here will help our institutions both protect and support immigrants in their own communities. In today's conversation about migration, I would be amiss to not mention the death of our beloved Pope Francis this past Monday. His words and actions have been a moral compass for the world in these years of increasing isolationism, skepticism towards our neighbors, and dehumanization of migrants. Therefore, I'd like to share the last line of Francis' recent letter to the U.S. Catholic bishops. With charity and clarity, we are all called to live in solidarity and fraternity, to build bridges that bring us closer together, to avoid walls, and to learn to give our lives as Jesus Christ gave his for the salvation of all. May the legacy of Pope Francis continue to live on in the words and actions of each of us here today. I would also like to present our speaker. Hillary Chester is the Vice President of International and Domestic Programs at the Jesuit Refugee Service of USA and brings years of experience in the immigration field, working in a variety of nonprofit and governmental organizations. She has lots of helpful information to share with us from her presentation, and we'll make sure and leave plenty of times for questions and answers at the end. I would also like to introduce our interpreter today. Andy Barrientos is from El Salvador, and she has worked with many Jesuit institutions throughout her career. We thank her especially for being with us here today. Before we let Hillary begin with the content, I'd like to have this moment to begin in prayer. I'd like to invite Lisbeth Ramajo Bauer, coordinator of the Red Jesuita con Migrantes CANA, or the Jesuit Network with Migrants of Central North America, to lead us in our opening prayer. And I need to give permission to share screen. Ok, Lisbeth, ¿se puede?
Queremos iniciar esta reunión agradeciendo a Dios por la vida del Papa Francisco y su legado en favor de las personas migrantes y refugiadas. Recordamos las palabras recientes del Papa Francisco en el último mensaje Urbi et Orbi el 20 de abril de este año, cuando dijo: ¿cuánto desprecio se tiene hacia los más débiles, los marginados y los migrantes? En este día quisiera que volviéramos a esperar y a confiar en los demás, incluso en quien no nos es cercano o proviene de tierras lejanas, con costumbres, estilos de vida, ideas y hábitos diferentes de los que a nosotros nos resultan más familiares, pues todos somos hijos de Dios. Recordamos la carta que envió a los obispos de Estados Unidos y que Harrison ya nos ha mencionado al inicio de esta reunión. Y recordamos algunas frases muy importantes que nos dejó el Papa. Los inmigrantes no son un peligro, están en peligro. Pero quien arriesga su vida en el mar no invade, busca acogida, busca vida. Que el legado del Papa Francisco ilumine y nos dé valentía en el acompañamiento a las personas migrantes y refugiadas. Amén.
Thank you very much, Lisbeth. And from here, we'll turn it over to Hillary.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Good afternoon a todos y todas. Thank you. I just want to give a little background about myself. I've now been with JRS USA for about 6 months. Prior to that, I worked for many years at the Bishops' Conference in their Office on Migrant and Refugee Services, in particular, heading up the anti-trafficking or counter-trafficking program, as well as working on alternative to detention projects, some pilot projects for asylum seekers, and then also working with unaccompanied minors, both in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters, as well as out in the field in Texas for many years. And so I've had a lot of contact over those years, working often side by side, often in a collaborative way with both Border Patrol and with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, primarily their Homeland Security Investigations, which is their arm that investigates crimes that have an intersection with migrants or migration, working a lot on human trafficking cases, and as well as some of the unaccompanied minor issues. Immediately prior to joining JRS USA, I actually worked for 2 years at ICE in their other office, not in Homeland Security Investigations, but in the other arm, the Enforcement and Removal Operations, also called ERO. And ERO is probably the part of ICE that most of us in the general public are the most familiar with. They are the officers who are running the detention facilities. ERO are the officers that go out into the community and apprehend people through their fugitive operations, through their targeted tactical, through their criminal apprehension program, as well as combing through, revising people who are incarcerated in the regular criminal justice system in the US, looking for immigrants or people with some kind of a temporary immigration status, and then they can make requests. So that Office of Enforcement and Removal Operations has a small unit that is meant to be somewhat protective in nature, providing technical assistance, in particular to the detention centers, on how to accommodate different directives and protocols around things like language access, mental health services, religious accommodations. And then also I served in that role representing all of those different ERO operations and their different facilities, and then the different agents and those different, the fugitive operations, et cetera. I represented all of them at what is the Homeland Security's Center for Countering Human Trafficking. And so I was the liaison in case there were potential victims of trafficking in detention or people who may have been incarcerated but were victims, helping to ensure that they were given the protections that at the time they were entitled to. It was an interesting couple of years. I learned a lot working there, being on the inside. It wasn't a great fit for me personally, so I'm back in the NGO world, back in the Catholic world, and super happy to be here. But I did learn a lot. I thought a lot going into that role, having worked alongside these different officers in these different capacities, but it was definitely enlightening to be on the inside. So what I will share today are just some tips, some context on both immigration and customs enforcement, in particular that enforcement removal operations, the ERO side, as well as Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection, CBP. All of the information I will be sharing is public facing. I am not going to, share anything that would be considered law enforcement sensitive. But it's a very complicated system. And even if all of this information, which is public facing, is not easy to navigate without some context and some background. So hopefully I can help provide that today. One of the things I will point out is that both Customs and Border Protection, CBP, or ICE fall within the Department of Homeland Security. And they also have other, in the US, relatively well-known offices as well, the TSA, the Transportation Security Agency, that are in our airports, the Coast Guard, FEMA, which is our emergency management agency. But ICE and CBP are sort of the most sort of public facing in a law enforcement capacity that we're probably the most concerned about when we think about the people who we are serving and accompanying. Border Patrol, their jurisdiction really is to some degree limited to the border sectors. Within 100 miles of a border, they are operational. They are operational as well in what are called ports of entry. And so that could be a marine port, like a coast port where ships come in. It could also be a port of entry in an airport, international airports where people are traveling in from other countries and they have to go through an immigration check. Those are also technically Customs and Border Protection agents. So they're present and that's their jurisdiction. They generally are not operational outside of those territories. I will let you know, just to be very mindful, that there are a lot of exceptions. There are a lot of rights that we in the United States think of as being our core civil rights that are not upheld to the same degree when you are within a port of entry or within that 100-mile corridor along one of our land borders. And so some of your rights to privacy, some of your rights to not being detained, some of your rights to not answering, not kind of being detained or being held against your will are quite honestly compromised in those areas. Similarly, I think most people here in the US think that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that the ICE agents that they may see out in the community, that their jurisdiction is limited to enforcement against immigrants or migrants or individuals with some kind of non-US citizen status. And that is not the case. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers are sworn law enforcement officers with a national scope, a national jurisdiction. I mentioned working with them on human trafficking cases. Very often they were absolutely arresting US citizens who had committed crimes with some kind of a a nexus to immigration. But over the years, their mandate has grown in that they do a lot of work on cybercrime, child exploitation cases. And as a result of their mandate and their law enforcement scope expanding beyond anything involving immigrants or migration or migrants at all, as a result, their jurisdiction has as well. And so I would just say be very mindful that ICE agents absolutely have that arresting authority when it comes to US citizens who may be, from their perspective, interfering in one of their operations. They would then, if they wanted to, they would turn cases over to the US attorneys for federal prosecution. But there are agreements in some places, and they generally have working relationships with local law enforcement. And at times, again, in the human trafficking context, we appreciated when they would do this. If they couldn't make a criminal case against someone, they would perhaps turn it over to local law enforcement who could make a case. And so I would just sort of give some caution that is that's their practice, and they can do that with any number of kinds of crimes. Again, thinking about interfering with some of their operations, for example. What I will share today are a couple of key websites that you will be able to use if you suspect that someone who is in one of the programs that you are serving is someone that has been accompanied by you or your program, or is, quite frankly, a family member or just someone in your community that you are concerned may have been apprehended, may have been picked up by either Border Patrol or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. While people are in Border Patrol custody, they're not technically searchable, because that's meant to be under a 72-hour window of time before they are processed by Border Patrol and turned over to ICE. But once someone is in ICE custody, they are searchable. It is possible to find whether or not someone is in custody and then where they might be located. And so I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So this is the landing page for what is called the Online Detainee Locator System, Online Detainee Locator System, or maybe ODLS for short. You can use this in a couple of different languages. If you are not a native English speaker, or if you are sending this to somebody who that you want to advise them to find their family member, for example, just let them know that these pages have been translated into these other languages. So it is possible to navigate this if you're not an English speaker, which is helpful. You should ideally, if you can, use what's called the alien number, the A number. That's probably the most reliable. Most people who have arrived in the last maybe 7 or 8 years have a 9-digit number. Some most often starting with a 2, so like 205 and then 6 more numbers. People who arrived prior to about 2005, 2006 may only have what looks like a 9-digit number. It may start like 96 and then have 6 more numbers, or 78. If that is the case, if someone has been in the US for many years and now you suspect that they have been picked up and are being detained, and that is happening increasingly here, that these are not just people crossing the border being apprehended, but the interior enforcement actions are unfortunately picking up people who have been in the US for many years. In that case, if they have one of these numbers that looks like it's only 8 digits, you would put a 0 at the beginning of that. You should add their country of birth. You need to have both of those pieces of information. If you don't have the A number and you need to use their name, you need to be very patient and try all different spellings until you think you have found the person that you're looking for. If your family or friend has an uncommon spelling of what is otherwise maybe a common name, and you're not finding them with their exact spelling, you might want to try just playing around with the letters so that you're able to ideally find the person. If you can't find someone in this system, it is possible to call, and I will go over how that might happen in a moment. Some people are being picked up and they are not being placed immediately into ICE custody, which is where people are held while a decision is made about whether they will be removed or not, or it may be if they are, well, the government wants to remove them. I will say that. So ICE is holding people in detention to facilitate their being removed, deported, most likely. There are opportunities, and I'll describe this, for people to get back out of detention while they are fighting their case and making their case not to be removed. But many people will start out in detention, and then I'll talk about how they might be able to get out. But if someone is in detention and you are pretty sure that they are in detention, but you are not finding them in this system, or you do find them in the system and it says they are not detained, what may have happened is they may have been charged with a crime. And so currently, in many more cases than in the past, ICE is charging people and having then the federal courts charge people with criminal reentry, with let's see, aggravated identity theft, if maybe they were using a different kind of ID or social security card because they weren't able to get one legitimately. And so if people have been charged with some kind of an immigration related charge, then they are turned over in that case to the U.S. Marshals Service, which is another law enforcement agency that is kind of federal in scope, national, it's not localized. There are two main facilities that are contracted by the U.S. Marshals Service to hold people on these kind of immigration-related criminal charges. And there is one in the Western District of Texas in Valverde County, and there is one in Arizona just outside of Phoenix. And so on the resource sheet that we have, that we will share out with you, are the two links there that you can click on, and then you will be able to call those two facilities and ask if your person that you're searching for is in one of those facilities. And that is the case if they're being charged with a criminal charge in particular. And then what will happen, honestly, is often they will be held there, and then after a few weeks, at some point, their case will be reviewed by the U.S. attorneys, the federal criminal prosecuting attorneys, who may or may not decide to go through with the charge. And then if they don't go through with charging them, they will go back into the ICE system. And then they may pop up that they are detained in the ICE locator system. If none of these are working, if you are not able to find somebody because perhaps the spelling of the name, maybe you don't have enough information to use these online systems, you can contact the local field office. So if you know roughly where someone was picked up by ICE, then you can filter this website by state, and you can then scroll down and find the field office in the different cities, and you can call them. Take your patience, because you may have to call multiple times, but you can call, and if someone is detained or was picked up and apprehended in that area, they will have a record. And generally what they can share essentially is like, yes, the person is in our custody, or no, we don't have that person in custody. There may be some exceptions that they wouldn't want to share that information, but generally they can at least acknowledge that much. Once you have been able to sort of figure out where someone was picked up, you can often, if they are being cooperative, you can sort of give them the information you have, and they can help you understand maybe why you're not finding it in the online locator system, perhaps correcting the spelling of what they have in their system versus your understanding of their spelling. It helps if you are an attorney of record. It helps if you are a direct family member for them to share information. And it just helps if you're polite, and then maybe they'll be more cooperative. Once you know that someone is detained, there are a couple of different ways that you can try and reach out to that person once they are detained. And so one way is when you know where they are, you can find the actual detention center and you can call it. On the web page, each center has several tabs of information where you can find out what's the number to call in order to tell someone that you are trying to reach them. They will only be given a message. You can't call in and talk to someone who is detained directly. But they can tell you when the visiting hours are and what the rules are about what kind of ID you need to bring, what ages people, some cases people can bring children, other cases they cannot. There's an app that you can subscribe to and put money into so that people who are in detention can make phone calls out on these tablets. It's relatively expensive. It's very expensive, but it's one of the only ways that they can call out to family or friends when they are in detention. And you cannot call in. You can leave messages telling them when to call, and then they can log in and call out. There are also, again, hours of visitation, how you can put money in their account so they can buy things like socks, snacks. And then if you're an attorney, there's a whole tab on how you would navigate the system in order to reach your client. And there is much more access for attorneys than for the general public when it comes to detainees, for sure. So if someone has an attorney, they are the best person to try and really make that contact. Okay. There is also, I will say, what's called the drill. It's a detention reporting and information line, drill. This is a toll-free number that anyone in the US or outside of the US can call. And they have a call center with I don't know, there's like 8 people that work there only. And they answer the phones from about 8 in the morning till 8 p.m. in the evening. Most of them also speak Spanish, so that's helpful. I think when I was there was an Arabic speaker. So they answer calls both from people who are not in detention trying to reach someone or get information about someone who is detained or file a complaint on behalf of someone who is detained. But they also are contacted by people who are in detention. There are telephones in the detention centers that can call a very limited number of resources. They can call the consulates, they can call some pro bono legal service providers, free and low cost legal service providers, and they can call this drill. And so they can call and they can reach these operators and they can make all kinds of complaints. And they can complain about treatment. They can complain about whether or not they're being given access to an interpreter. They can complain about if they're being missed meals, if they've asked for halal or kosher or some other kind of meal and it's not being provided. They can complain about their deportation officer not providing updates on the status of their case. All of these calls are logged. They're all recorded. And it's really helpful in this system to have more and more calls, because then they are more likely to raise up and get attention. And so anytime someone calls this number, whether they're in the facility, whether they're in detention, or an outside person is calling, it's recorded and it becomes a task number. And so it's assigned to people who have to respond, who have to kind of solve the problem or at least address the problem. And so if they don't address the problem by closing it out in the system, it stays open. And then if there's another request for the same issue, it just piles up. Everybody has a boss, and in law enforcement, that's very important that you're keeping up with your workload. And so people who are using the drill generally will get responses. They may or may not be able to address the situation, but at least you will, in most cases, be able to speak with someone who can at least tell you what is happening, what possible remedies there might be, possible solutions. So I encourage you rather to try this drill call. It's also a way of getting more information because, again, it will bubble up to the correct person and they may reach out back to you in some cases. This is another place where you can request for someone to be released from detention for a humanitarian reason. And so if someone has, if they are the sole caregiver of their children, if they have a medical condition, a significant mental health condition, if they have, if they are caregiving for someone in the community who is perhaps disabled or is a senior and someone is being left uncared for, you can try and make these humanitarian requests for their release. They need to be pretty compelling, to be honest, but they may be considered. So that is one avenue. There used to be a place that you could call and make these kind of requests, an office that dealt with these kind of requests. They seem to have done away with that. So now you would need to start with this drill line, and then you can also go back to that field office. So if you know where someone is being detained, you can, you can go back to that list of all of the different field offices, and you'll call in and you kind of start at the bottom and just keep trying to work your way up to a more and more kind of senior person to just ask about having someone to be released for these humanitarian reasons. And again, every call you make is logged, and so it's documented that someone needs to be responding, and that's helpful. I will say that they will also, it's not totally clear when you call these numbers that this is the case, that it's all being recorded and logged. And very often people would, when they were calling the drill, for example, from outside of detention, they might say, oh, I want to complain on behalf of someone who's in detention, but I don't want to leave my name. I don't want to give my number. Surprise, it's all recorded already. And so even though it may seem like you can make an anonymous call, the reality is you should understand and you should expect that anytime you're calling any of their numbers, any of their help numbers, it's all being recorded and logged. Your incoming phone number, and then if you have a name attached to it, then that's in the system. So know that. Okay. In addition to these resources and ways of trying to reach people who are in detention, there are other places that you can get information about people. You can find out, let's see, you can find out the status of their immigration case. Do they have a prior deportation order? Are they going to reinstate? It's called that deportation order. If you're an attorney, they will share a lot more information with you. If you're a direct family member, they may share some of that information with you. Again, there's, let's see, there's a way to do some of the kind of providing information if you are not detained, but you need to be checking in with ICE. If you have a requirement to check in, you can do a lot of that online. And then there are a lot of things you can also do about changing your address, filing some of these different forms, and providing biometric information to move your immigration case forward. A lot of that can be done in the ICE portal. The ICE portal has a lot of different languages, so it can be navigated, not just in English. And so that's helpful. And this is helpful because it enables people to do things so they don't have to go to an ICE office, quite frankly. If it's possible to do it online, do it online, so that people are not going to these ICE offices more often than they really need to. Let's see. If someone is detained, they're also, unless they have committed some very serious crimes in the recent past, there usually is an opportunity to at least request what is called a bond. And a bond is when you are putting up money so that the person is released. And then when that person reappears or shows up for their court hearing in their immigration case, they're complying with checking back in and pursuing their case, then that money can be returned, either if their case is closed and it's resolved, or unfortunately, if they're taken back into custody and ultimately they are removed. you would get that money back. But it's a way of securing, it's a way of demonstrating the seriousness of this person is definitely going to comply and come back to court. And so they can sometimes be given an opportunity to pay a bond to get out of detention. There's a form for that. And the link is in the resource we're sharing. It's an online application form they have in a couple different languages, so you can read through like how to go about requesting the bond, how to secure the funds in order to get that bond if it's approved. I don't know, to be totally honest, what the rate of bond approval is these days. It fluctuates. Sometimes they're very I don't want to say generous, it's not the right word. Sometimes they're very liberal with allowing people to have bonds, other times not. And again, if the person in question may have had any kind of criminal charge or an arrest, even if they weren't convicted, however small, the likelihood that they would get a bond drops pretty dramatically. Okay. The last thing I want to just talk about are a bit more of the helpful side, if you will. If you need to file a complaint because you or someone you were working with was mistreated, either by Border Patrol or by ICE, that can be physical mistreatment and abuse. It can, what's the word? Like a use of force, an inappropriate use of force. If people collateral, if people in the immediate vicinity were mistreated or abused in the process of them apprehending one individual, those kind of complaints should be filed. There is the Office of, it's called the Office of Professional Responsibility. So far has not been dismantled, so that's positive. And so you can file complaints. You can file complaints against, again, ICE or Border Patrol. It's two different, they're two different agencies, so they have two different offices of professional responsibility. So there's the one for, I believe this is for ICE, and then there is the one for Border Patrol. And so as much information as you can provide, if you saw the person's name or badge number, that's the best. If you didn't, knowing exactly when an apprehension took place or the interdiction or the altercation or the abuse, whatever it is, if you know when it happened and where it happened, some of that can be traced back to individuals because they're all documenting all of their actions. And so it may still be possible, and it is still worth probably making a complaint. If it was a really serious abuse, a really serious transgression, a use of force where someone was really injured, that could be a crime. It does happen that that people who are quite seriously abused or assaulted by either Border Patrol or ICE, their cases are moved through the process, and they, as a victim of a crime, may actually be able to get immigration release. I will say those are rare, but they do happen. So certainly something to take quite seriously. Let's see, other helpful, there used to be, let's see, so I think I mentioned the Homeland Security investigations. They are the arm of ICE that really is looking into crimes against migrants, crimes with an intersection with immigration in general. They've really expanded in the areas, again, of child sexual abuse, commercial sexual exploitation of children, like online, cyber crimes, trafficking beyond just foreign nationals. And so their mandate and jurisdiction is really expanded. But in general, they will look into cases where migrants have been abused, not by them per se. That would be the internal professional responsibility. But people who are abused by their smugglers, people who are put in stash houses, people who are extorted or held for ransom, people who are kidnapped for ransom, people who are pushed and or compelled into some form of human trafficking. Any of those kind of crimes, you absolutely can report those. HSI fought for a long time to have a hotline number that didn't mention ICE, because of just so many people are very fearful of ICE. So there for a while was an HSI Homeland Security Investigation tip line number that didn't mention ICE. It looks like that was dismantled in the last couple of weeks, and so now we are back to using the hotline that references ICE. I will send out that correction, that update. But there also is this online tip line where you can, if it's an emergency, for sure, call 911. If you need local law enforcement to come out right away and deal with something, then use that. But if you're hearing from a client about something that happened in the recent past or during their migration journey, then you can use this form, and hopefully one of the investigators will contact you. I will note that Homeland Security Investigations has full-time victim assistance program specialists who are social workers, clinical social workers by training. They also have forensic interviewers who also are primarily social workers by training and have a lot of experience, in particular with child victims or victims of sexual assault and highly like traumatic experiences. And so it's not only an investigator that might speak with a victim, it could be some of these specialists that are better trained with that victim-centered lens. There also used to be what was called the Missing Migrant Program from Border Patrol, where they were like a special team that would help locate, and they would help comb through their own records of apprehensions and interdictions, and try and find people who may have gone missing in the desert, for example. It seems to have been dismantled in the last few weeks, but there is still the Border Patrol Search, Trauma, and Rescue, BORSTAR, which is it's a specially trained team. They're all along the different border sectors, north and south, and they are specially trained in like medical emergency response. They're like first aid. And they have all kinds of really amazing technology, like helicopters and rapid water rescue gear and boats and things. So they are still an active group. There's no way to contact them at this point directly, it appears, anymore. But they are still active. They are still heavily recruiting and training. So I know they still have a team that's intact, or multiple teams, in fact. So it may be that if you, again, are just concerned about a person, a family member, someone from one of your programs that has gone missing, or a family is reporting a relative that has gone missing, that they knew they were crossing the border more or less at a certain place in a certain day, and then they just never seemingly made it and didn't seem to be apprehended. You can call the Border Patrol General Information number and just emphasize that you're trying to reach someone about like a distressed or a missing migrant, and they will hopefully route you now back to this BORSTAR. Maybe the missing migrant program folks are still active as well. And I will just highlight the other resource for those kind of inquiries is the International Red Cross, their family tracing program. It is possible, just like you would with refugees and people in these humanitarian disasters where people are moving quickly and people can be separated. They also do work with ICE and with Border Patrol, and the Central Tracing Agency, this family tracing, there's a small group of 4 or 5 people that work specifically on U.S., Mexico, and to less extent U.S., Canada border sectors in trying to locate people. And so you can reach out to them, and they will be able to reach people on the ICE side in order to see whether someone had been encountered, had been perhaps detained at some point or not. So that's really everything I have to share. I'm happy to open it up to questions for these last 15 minutes or so. There are more and more resources being pulled together with these kind of helpful links and helpful background, as unfortunately more people are being apprehended and placed in detention. So I think Harrison has also maybe shared some of those that came out recently from the Immigration Legal Resource Center, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hillary. That was really wonderful. Your experience and your expertise here are super valuable to the network. We do have about 10 minutes for questions. And as Hillary mentioned, we'll be sharing all of these resources afterwards. Both Hillary has a list of resources, and the resources she mentioned, National Immigration Legal Centers or Law Centers has been putting out some really helpful resources, and will soon be coming out in multiple languages. But there's a couple questions already in the chat, Hillary, if you'd like to look there.
Yeah.
And then I see one hand went up. We'll let Hillary address those in the chat. If you have a question and you would like to say it in Spanish, just put it in the chat in Spanish. You read Spanish. And then Hillary, if you could repeat those in English,
yes.
the questions that are in Spanish. Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Oh, let me go to the top. Let's see. It looks like it's about Zoom. So someone is asking if they are, oh, I should have slowed down too, sorry. They are asking if they are a US citizen and observe an ICE interaction in public, do you have the right to record that? And I will say, maybe. I'm not an attorney. And so to make that kind of legal interpretation is more complicated than you would think. In general, you can record things unless, and I will say this, unless the ICE officers seem to think from their perspective that you are interfering with their operation. And in that case, then no, you may not have the right to record something, or you may not have the right to try and intervene on behalf of someone if they think you're interfering from their perspective. And then this would be the kind of situation where perhaps you would be arrested, perhaps they would threaten to arrest you. If you were arrested, it would become a legal argument. Did you have the right? Were you interfering? They think you were interfering. You don't think you were interfering. So I'm not dissuading you from standing up for people, certainly not dissuading you from recording, but just be mindful that there are cases, there are situations where from their perspective you are interfering, and they can push that argument to the limit. So I will just, the farther perhaps away you are, the better, as long as you can still record, but without clearly interfering in some way is maybe safer. But again, I'm not an attorney. What else? How does an attorney of record become official? There's paperwork called a G28 where you and the client essentially sign an agreement. It's possible to do that online. I will add that link. I will add that link to the resources, and we can send out an updated version. So you can fill that out online. It will show up in the tablet to the person who's in detention. And if they concur that you are their attorney of record, then it's filed in the system, and then you will have so much more access to them. Yes. Do you have protocol for student, staff, or faculty member if detained? It would be smart for institutions to have some sort of an official who becomes that liaison and has perhaps the legal connection to be given more information, to do more information sharing about someone who is detained. That would probably be a very smart move to have. Let's see. Oh. What is it? I'm not unsure. It. All you have shared is considering ICE follows their protocols and procedures. In some cases, they are not. So that's a great question. And that is, I think, what is at the heart of many of these now lawsuits about people who are being detained by ICE and then taken out of ICE detention. And I didn't mention this, but there is kind of this now, there are people who are in the community who are in removal proceedings and they have to check in. There are people in detention who are in removal proceedings. There is now this third, it's not quite detention, and that is really problematic. I don't know personally what the answer is, because it's such uncharted territory. To have people sent off to Guantanamo Bay is, at least then they are still arguably in ICE custody. There still are ways for attorneys to reach them. It's more difficult to even find out if someone is there or not, but it is possible. People being sent out of the country entirely is really uncharted territory, and I'm afraid I don't have any kind of good response for that. But I will say, and I don't want to say you should harass people in ICE, but they do have policies that they do have to follow. Everything is documented in these systems, every call logged. And so when people are in the detention facilities in the US, you should push for them to follow their own policies as much as possible. Let's see. Can you talk about the difference between the ICE or DHS detention experience? And so ICE detention, I mean, most people that are in ICE detention are in detention simply because the government has determined that they are, and how they determine this is probably, it's not great, but they've determined that the person is a danger to the community, or they've determined that the person is not likely to comply with the removal order, and so they are arguing they have to hold the person. The exceptions to that, again, are if people who are being charged with something criminal and they're in the federal marshal's custody. If they're convicted, they will go into a criminal detention center. If they're not convicted, if the U.S. attorneys are like, this is crazy, we're not going to prosecute this, then they will go back into the immigration detention system, which is, again, not criminal, even though some people are held in jails because ICE has contracts with jails to hold people. People who are in asylum can be detained. And again, if someone is people are applying for asylum, and maybe they have a really strong case, but the government is like, yeah, but you're coming from this particular country and that's a national security threat, or but you had this criminal history in your deep past, or sometimes they do get information from the home countries on criminal history. So they can make that argument, and that's where an attorney would come on their behalf and make the counter argument, trying to get a bond, for example, and say, fine, if you're so worried, we'll pay a $5,000 or more like a $50,000 or whatever bond. And so there's that piece of trying to get people out of detention. The idea that people are afraid to show up for court dates, they're afraid to go for their ICE check-ins is a new reality with no good solution, to be totally honest. It's not a good idea not to go to court, because if you don't show up at court, you will probably then just be given what's called an absentia order, which is essentially your case is closed, you're given a deportation order. And because you didn't show up, there's an additional penalty of it being an absentia order, which then if you ever were able to come back to the US legally, you might have that on your record, and they can say, oh, even if you could come back, you can't come back for 5 or 10 years as your punishment, or you would have to pay thousands of dollars extra to waive that absentia order. And so it's not good to not go to your hearing, because the hearing will move on without you and you will be given an order. But I do understand certainly that people are now being picked up in the parking areas around courts. In some cases, I think we've heard, and the same with the ICE check-in. If you don't go to your ICE check-in, that hurts your immigration case. It hurts how they're going to describe your character. And yet, it certainly now more than ever is a risk to showing up and being what you think is compliant and then ending up in detention. And so, yeah, there's no good answer. It has to just be a really personal decision, I think. Sorry, that's not a good one. I'm not sure.
I have my hand raised. I don't know if I can ask the question.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much, Hillary. It's about a community member of our organization. So he was detained on February, and he was facing deportation. He's of Venezuelan origin, and he was here in Michigan for, I want to say, like a month. But then he was transferred to another facility in Texas for the for the removal proceedings to happen. And then we lost track of him. So we were able to communicate with him every day while he was in Michigan, but then in Texas, we only could talk to him once, and then we could never reach out to him back. So we do not really know his whereabouts after this, and we have tried to reach out to the number he called us from, but we haven't been successful.
Sometimes it helps to go to the field office. So if you knew what detention facility he was in, you can then look and see what field office that is. And then you call the field office and you just keep calling, and you call, and you should be able to speak with his deportation officer. Maybe I can make some notes in the resource. You can ask to speak to the supervisor of the deportation officers. They don't have to necessarily go along with that, but the more you ask, and the more you ask in the sort of correct chain of command, the more likely they will, again, because all of these calls are at least being logged, and it begins to look like someone's not doing their job. It can just look like something isn't being resolved, and you may not get good news. It may be that they will tell you that he's been transferred somewhere else or he has been removed, but you may be more likely to get a response if you go to the field office. The field offices work very independently. They're very autonomous. There's a field office director in every field office, and they really set some of their own, not policies exactly, but they definitely kind of set the tone and how cooperative are people and how responsive. But they definitely, people don't like to see a lot of unanswered questions and calls. And so that's kind of my best advice, is to go to the field office and start asking their deportation officer, the supervisor, work your way up. Yeah. And again, some of this is just, we've never just sent people out of the country before. And so some of it is so outside of what is normal that there aren't policies that to follow. There aren't numbers to call to find out some of this information. Unfortunately, that's the sort of scary place.
Yeah, no, but thank you so much. I do appreciate this. We sadly don't have the field office in Texas, but
you know where he was detained? Because we can figure out from that. He was
detained, and I can reach out later if you want, but he was detained in Battle Creek, Michigan, in the field office of Battlefield. And we tried reaching out to them, but they said that since we are not their attorney, they don't have to provide any information. But I think we can keep on calling until they told us exactly where. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Hillary. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering
Sure.
all the questions we would get to. If we weren't able to get to your questions or other questions pop up, if you email me, I can share those and we can kind of try to consolidate those and get those answered in the follow-up email. I'll be sending out a follow-up email with all of Hillary's resources and some other resources that we'll have that we think will be relevant. We also want to say we've been trying to respond to what we think the needs are within the network to answer people's questions, to help people feel prepared. And so if there are questions or webinars that you think would be helpful, feel free to reach out to me, just shoot me an email and say, hey, this would be really helpful for my community as a school or a parish or a community center or whatever. And we'll see if we can get something coordinated. Anything else, Hillary, that you'd like to share before we log off?
But I will make some updates to this resource and we can circulate it back around again. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank
you all. Yeah.
And a special thank you to Andy as well for translating.
Sorry.
She made this available to all of our colleagues throughout the Americas or any Spanish speakers anywhere. And so that's really valuable.
Yeah.
We're certainly in dark times. These are difficult times. But as people of faith, we are called to respond not with fear, but with courage and compassion and the belief that together we can continue to work to make a better world possible. And so we continue to walk hand in hand towards the beloved community that God envisioned for all of us. Thank you for being with us today, and may God continue to bless you and your work and your communities.